House, bienvenue dans...
Welcome to this meeting of the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities at the House of Commons. So, pursuant to the order of reference of Tuesday, September 26, 2023, the committee meets to resume with the consideration of clause by clause on the Bill C-33 and Act. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders, and therefore members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application.
Some feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to our interpreters and cause serious injuries. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to the microphone. We therefore ask all participants to exercise a high degree of caution when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone of your neighbor's microphone is turned on. In order to prevent incidents and safeguard the hearing health of the interpreters, I invite all members as well as our witnesses to ensure that they speak into the microphone into which their headset is plugged in, and to avoid manipulating the earbuds by placing them on the table away from the microphone when they are not in use. Also, colleagues and witnesses, when speaking, please speak slowly and clearly, and when you are not speaking, your microphone should be on mute. Just a quick reminder there. Colleagues, to help us with clause-by-clause consideration of Bill C-33, I'd like to now welcome our witnesses back who have done a steadfast job thus far. We have from the Department of Transport, Sonia Reid, Director General, Marine Policy. We have Heather Moriarty, Director, Ports Policy. We have Rachel Heft, Manager and Senior Counsel, Transport and Infrastructure Legal Services. And we have, of course, Amy Kaufman, Counsel. And once again, we have joining us our legislative clerks, Philippe Mela and Jean-François Pagé. Merci de votre présence encore une fois. Colleagues, I hope you had a wonderful break. We'll now dive in to Clause 125 with CPC amendment. And with that, I will open the floor for the first time in 2024. 124, yes. Yeah. So we'll open up debate. 124. So we'll go to a vote. Oh, Mr. Badaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to be clear, this is motion 124. And can we read out what exactly we're actually dealing with right now, just so that all committee members recognize what the amendment is? Or, I'm sorry, the clause.
Ms. Reid, did you want to speak to that? Or perhaps, I think Mr. Badaway was looking for, do you want to clarify what you're looking for?
Yeah, I'm just looking for some commentary on 124.
Certainly. Provision 124 ensures that the Transportation Appeal Tribunal of Canada Act, which oversees some provisions of this legislation in terms of requests for review of administrative monetary penalties, that the provisions of this bill, should they come into effect prior to those of Bill C-26, will ensure that both amendments to that legislation are effective, in that if this bill amends those provisions and later C-26 also amends those same provisions of the Transportation Appeal Tribunal of Canada Act, that all those amendments will be coordinated and come into force.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway.
When we had that explanation at the last meeting. We could have saved ourselves a lot of time. No, we said all we have to say on this.
Okay,
on this
thank you,
clause.
Mr. Strahl. So we'll go to a vote on 124. Yes, Mr. Backrack.
Oh, can I just be clear? Are we voting on CPC 9.1? Or are we before
No,
that?
124.
Clause 125. My
124.
apologies.
Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
Gotcha.
So shall clause 124 carry? Thank you, Mr. Strahl. So we'll now go to clause 125. It carried. It did carry. Yeah, it carried, yes. CBC 9? No. This one first? No. Backrack.
So I believe NDP 16.1
That was just pointed out
is
by...
first in the order. However, the Liberals amended NDP 15.1 to include this, so I don't believe it's necessary at this point. So we won't be bringing it forward, and we're happy to move on to the next amendment.
Turn it over to Mr. Strahl, I believe.
Thank you. This, we had a lot of debate about this section, which was the accelerated thermal coal ban, and we just wanted to clarify that as per the government's previous statements on this thermal coal ban, that it would come into effect no earlier than January 1st, 2031. This would clarify that this section that we debated about including a thermal coal ban in a bill on port modernization, that would not come into effect until January 1st, 2031, keeping with the spirit of the government's commitments and keeping with spirit in the negotiations that I understand are underway between industry and government on this. So it just is attempts to clarify that the section that was amended to include a thermal coal ban would not come into force until January 1st, 2031.
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. Yes, Mr. Backrack.
I have a bit of a different understanding than Mr. Strahl on this one. The amendment that we voted on prior to the break essentially reaffirmed the government's own commitment to phase out thermal coal exports by 2030. So the date in that amendment is the date of the commitment. Now the challenge and the amendment that we worked hard to include has to do with the consultation of the relevant trade unions that are involved in the export of thermal coal to ensure that topics like the continuation of collective agreements, pension bridging, securing other opportunities in marine transportation are discussed with them prior to the phase-out coming into effect. And so that amendment, which carried, now compels the government to consult those unions and to discuss those matters with the people who are most affected. My concern is that if this entire statute doesn't come into force until January 1st, 2031, there's nothing to compel the government from to engage in those consultations prior to that date. So I very much, it's going to be a process leading up to the phase out. And what we want is for the government to consult the workers as soon as possible. And hopefully those consultations are already underway. It sounded from our discussions with the officials like they aren't in a formal way. But they should engage those groups as soon as possible. My concern is that if we support this amendment, the work that we've done to compel the government to have those conversations won't actually come into effect until 2031, which I believe is too late. So I'll be voting against this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Ambassador Duval.
After a long debate that ended differently than I expected, I think there were already amendments that were brought to the implementation of the coal exports. But the new amendment here with a new date, I'm just trying to understand how this is compatible with what was already voted on, first of all, and secondly, what would that change in the process that we already adopted? And perhaps the analysts or some of the witnesses, maybe the witnesses more, could clarify this for us. So the impact of this change, given what we've already adopted. So what would that change in concrete terms?
Thank you.
Over to you, Ms. Reid.
Thank you for the question. It's a very good question. Our understanding of the provisions that were originally amended provisions provided for the regulations to be made within 48 months after the coming into effect, but that the regulations would themselves prohibit the import or I think it's the loading and unloading of thermal coal after December 31st, 2030. So that was when the regulations would prevent that activity from happening after that date. If the provision itself does not come into effect, the regulation-making authority does not come into effect until January 1st, 2031, my understanding is that we would actually not be able to make the regulations. Is that correct?
Yes, that's our understanding.
Okay, so our understanding is that if the provision regarding a regulation-making authority does not take effect until January 1st, 2031, we would not be able to make the regulations until that date, which means that we would not be, that the provisions that indicate when the regulations are supposed to be in effect would be after the date that the authority actually comes into effect. And so that there might be a misalignment there.
Yes, Ms. Gladue.
I'm late to the party, so I apologize. But so do I understand correctly that the loading and unloading is permitted until December 31st, 2030, the way the bill has already been amended?
Yeah, our understanding is that the way that the bill has been amended, the regulation-making authority would take effect as of the coming into force of the provisions in the bill generally. The regulations must be made within 48 months, but the actual prohibition of the activity would not take effect until after December 31st, 2030.
Thank you, Ms. Gladue. Any other questions, comments, colleagues? Yes, Mr. Radaway.
I just wanted to clarify that this sub-amendment is in fact admissible.
I have consulted Mr. Badaway with the legislative clerks, and they say that it is indeed admissible.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. Questions, comments, colleagues? Seeing none, we'll go to a vote. I'll turn it over to you, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Badaway,
No.
Mr. Iacono,
Nope.
Ms. Koutrakis. No. Ms. Yip,
No.
Mr. Rogers,
No.
Mr. Stroll,
Yes.
Mr. Muse,
Yes.
Ms. Gladue,
Yes?
Mr. Lewis. Yes. Monsieur Barcelo Duval,
No.
Mr. Bachrach, 4 yeas, 7 nays.
The amendment does not carry. We will now go to Clause 125 and ask, shall 125 carry? And I'll turn it over to on division. Okay. Carried on division. Colleagues, Clause 102 was stood, and so we will go back to that now with CPC 4, and I will open that up for debate. Yes, Mr. Strahl.
Yes, I'm unsure what we eventually came to. We kind of gave this back to officials to come up with a way to get us where we wanted to go, which was to provide a remedy for lengthy vacancies where board appointments had not been made. In some cases, we heard for several years, to provide an incentive perhaps for a minister to make those appointments in a timely fashion. But it was suggested that 6 months was too short of a time period. So we talked about 1 year, and then we did want to also ensure that any work that we did, any amendments that had been made on the bill, which there have been amendments made to the composition of boards, the nomination processes, et cetera, would not be lost, that it wouldn't be a way for boards to avoid their responsibilities under the C-33 should it pass, and the changes that were made in terms of labor, nominating directors, et cetera. So I don't know. We kind of threw it back onto the laps of officials and the legislative clerks. I'm not sure what they came up with, or if they have any further comments. But that we stood it because we didn't want to get locked in on the 6 months, and we wanted to make sure that the changes that have been made through the work of this committee were reflected, that this wasn't an end around on the other nominating requirements. So I really throw it back to the officials for commentary, and would be willing to discuss with colleagues the best way forward here.
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. I'll turn it over to the officials for a response to that.
My understanding is that as officials, we aren't in a position to put forward any language in respect of amendments. I would seek clarity on that. However, my understanding is that the end of discussion was regarding the time frame for the length of appointments. We had noted that 6 months was too short, that I believe the time frame that had been put forward at the last meeting would enable, I think, a 12-month period. And then the other concern was whether or not the language would, given that until the board appoints an individual, there would be a concurrent process that could be underway within the Government of Canada in respect of the GIC process of appointments, whether or not it would be suitable to have a notification provision so that there would not be concurrent, or there would reduce the risk of the potential of concurrent appointments. I think that was the key considerations that were identified.
Thank you, Ms. Reid. Mr. Strahl.
I know that we had some internal back and forth. I'm not sure I'm not sure that the legislative clerk could provide some guidance on what those discussions look like. I know that not all of the C-33 process has been collaborative, but this was one that we did kind of all agree that we were going to look for some guidance on. I'd be willing to hear a time frame that was accepted, 12 months. If that's too short, it seemed like a reasonable time. But I can't amend my own amendment. But there was some agreement, as I recall, back when we were discussing this, that vacancies are unacceptable after a certain length of time, and there should be a remedy provided. So I don't know if any colleagues, if they're just going to vote this down, or if we can actually make this work. But I recall us. I can go. I don't have the blues in front of me, but there was a discussion about us putting it into the hands of officials to capture what we were trying to come up with.
Thank you, Mr. Stroll. I'll turn it over to Mr. Barcel-Duval, suivi par Mr. Bachrach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think in the previous discussions, I had said that I was very willing to propose an amendment to the amendment to go from 6 to 12 months. And I can repeat that here. I could make a proposal out of it or a motion out of it so that we go to 12 months in CPC 4. In terms of the other concerns that were raised or for which there could be potential amendments, I'm also open, but I don't have specific wording to propose. But I share the concerns in terms of this desire to reach 12-month period. Thank you. All right. I think Mr. Bachrach had already submitted a sub-amendment in both official languages, so maybe we're more ready with Mr. Bachrach's amendment. You'll correct me if I'm wrong.
Roughly the same as what Mr. Barcel-Duval was.
Alors, on pourrait considérer que je retiens le mien en attendant.
Okay. Well, I will withdraw. I will wait to see what Mr. Bachrach proposes.
I'll turn it over to you to speak to your sub-amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think Mr. Barcel-Duval and I are thinking along the same lines, which is that we like the spirit of the original amendment, which is to create some accountability so that we're not seeing these long delays in appointing board members. It's something that the Port Authorities expressed as a concern when they came and appeared before the committee. And so perhaps there's a middle ground that can be found by extending the 6 months to 12 months, and also including a clause that would require the boards of Port Authorities to give the minister notice that they intend to invoke this clause, which could, how shall we say, create some incentive to accelerate the process if there are barriers that can be broken through by working more diligently on it or allocating more resources to finding board members. It would give a heads up so it's not a surprise to the department. So there's a sub-amendment in front of committee members. I can read it. Part A, replacing 6 months in subsection 1.2 with 12 months and adding the following after subsection 1.2. 1.3, the board of directors of a port authority shall give notice to the minister of its intention to make an appointment under subsection 1.2 at least 90 days before doing so.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. I'll turn it over to Mr. Badaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just receiving this now and hearing Mr. Bachrach's comments, we will, in fact, be in favor of the sub-amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. Any other questions or comments with regards to Mr. Bachrach's sub-amendment? If not, we'll go to a vote. Go for it. Why not?
Mr. Badaway?
Yes.
Monsieur Iacono?
Oui.
Madame Koutrakis?
Yes.
Miss Yip?
Yes.
Mr. Rogers?
Yes.
Mr. Stroll?
Yes.
Mr. Muse?
Yes.
Miss Gladue?
Oui.
Mr. Lewis?
Yes.
Monsieur Barcel-Duval?
Oui.
Mr. Bachrach?
In favor.
12 yeas, 11 yeas, 0 nays.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. The sub-amendment is adopted, and now we will go to CPC 4 as amended. I'll turn it back over to you, Madam Clerk.
Sure. Mr. Badaway?
Yes.
Yes.
Monsieur Iacono,
Yes.
Madame Koutrakis,
Oui.
Miss Yip,
Yes.
Mr. Rogers,
Yes.
Mr. Straw,
Yes.
Mr. Muse, Miss Gladue,
Oui.
Mr. Lewis,
Yes.
Monsieur Barsalou Duval,
Oui.
Mr. Backrack,
Favor.
11 yeas, 0 nays.
Thank you very much once again, Madam Clerk. It carries. CPC 4 as amended carries. We'll now go to Clause 102 as amended. I'll turn it back over to you, Madam Clerk.
Division?
You're going to deny me the joy. On division? Why don't we actually go, just to make sure everybody's on the same page? Thank you, Madam Clerk.
Okay. Mr. Bellaway,
Yes.
Monsieur Iacono,
Yes.
Madame Koutrakis,
Oui.
Miss Yip,
Oui.
Mr. Rogers,
Yes.
Mr. Straw,
Yes.
Mr. Muse,
Yes.
Miss Gladue,
Yes.
Mr. Lewis,
Yes.
Monsieur Barsalou Duval,
Oui.
Mr. Backrack,
Yes.
11 yeas, 0 nays.
Thank you once again, Madam Clerk. Clause 102 carried as amended. Colleagues, we are this close, and I'm very excited. We have one last hurdle to jump through here, and that is schedule NDP 17, which I will turn back over to Mr. Backrack to speak to.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment is simply the schedule, including the coordinates of the areas of concern in the Southern Gulf Islands in British Columbia. I'll just note that these coordinates reflect Parks Canada's proposed National Marine Conservation Area for the Salish Sea and the ecologically and biologically significant area identified by Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And these are also areas that have been identified by the communities of the Gulf Islands as being of concern. Our amendment does not prevent anchorage in those areas. It simply limits the duration of anchorage to 2 weeks and empowers the minister to require vessels to move along after a 2-week period. We've seen long stays in those ecologically sensitive areas, and the residents of that area are extremely concerned about the impact of industrial traffic, marine traffic, not only on the ecology but on the quality of life in those rural communities. So I know Ms. Gladue offered to debate every latitude and longitude, which as a former geography major I would be happy to engage with. But I think, given that we have already voted on the spirit of the amendment, I would hope that we could pass this in due course and finish our work on Bill C-33. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Backrack. Mr. Strahl.
I would hope Mr. Backrack, given his expertise, could perhaps talk to us about sinuosity for some time. But I do think we have expressed our concerns, which were echoed by departmental officials, about the unintended consequences of placing limits on anchorages without having done the work of creating additional anchorages elsewhere. It is fine to say that ships should not be able to stay at anchor in spite of any number of issues that are outside of their control, including port congestion, including labor disputes at the port, including bad weather, including mechanical issues, that to just simply indicate that they cannot stay there and they must move off no matter what, I think we heard from departmental officials is ill-advised. And our advice in that discussion was that if you're going to shut down anchorages, you should be opening up other ones. And no work has been done in that regard. So we believe that this is this entire idea while I understand the impetus for it, is irresponsible for a government that believes in a reliable and a robust supply chain, that this will actually have a negative impact which runs counter to the purpose of this legislation. So with that, we won't debate the thence northeasterly along the sinuosities of this schedule, but we will register again our concern of the impacts that this will have on our supply chain and on marine shipping and Canada's reliability in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. I'll turn over to Mr. Badaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we have now found the word of the day, sinuosity. Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. With that, through you, Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask for some comments from members of the team, if we can get some comments on this.
I'll turn it over to Ms. Reed.
Certainly. In respect of the coordinates themselves on the schedule, I would note that when we were looking at the coordinates as proposed, there was some concern about whether or not they were located in some of the coordinates were completely correct. I don't have details in respect of the actual coordinates themselves in front of me right now, but I would say that that was one of the concerns about whether or not they were actually reflective of the geographic area under concern, which was the Southern Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Ms. Reed. I'll turn it over to Mr. Bachrach, perhaps if he wants to comment. If he doesn't, that's okay as well.
So I do believe that a map has been drawn up confirming the boundaries. That was confirmed with the legislative clerks and the drafters that worked on the sub-amendment at a couple of stages. Maybe legislative clerk is the wrong word. The drafters insisted that we map out the coordinates as part of the exercise so that we could confirm that indeed the areas do reflect the areas of concern. And we can provide that map if it's of interest to the committee. With regard to Mr. Strahl's comments, I think what we also heard over the course of the debate on this bill is that one of the goals of C-33, and the government has assured us that this is going to make the supply chain more efficient. It's going to reduce congestion at ports and reduce the need for anchorages because of all of the many things that they've jammed in here to give the government additional powers to reduce blockages and direct traffic. Ports are moving towards active traffic management systems that are going to make them more like airports in regard to directing marine traffic. I think all of those things are going to dramatically reduce the likelihood that we'll find ourselves in a similar situation to the one we found ourselves in during the pandemic, which saw an extraordinary amount of traffic backed up in areas and anchored in areas that were having real negative impacts on people and on the environment. So maybe we'll agree to disagree on this one. I know that this matter has a tremendous amount of support from the residents of those communities. This is something they feel very strongly about. And we are talking about a very unique and precious part of the British Columbia coast that's home to all sorts of important species, including southern resident killer whales, Chinook salmon, and other species of concern. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully we can move on to a vote.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. I'll turn it over to Mr. Badaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess another question to Mr. Bachrach. With respect to the areas of which you outline within this sub-amendment, I'm assuming, and you mentioned that the residents would support this, I'm assuming that you've had some dialogue with the residents of the areas?
Yes, we have had dialogue with residents of the areas, as have my colleagues, my MP colleagues who represent those areas. It's an issue of grave concern for them. And we heard from some of those stakeholders at committee during debate on this bill. We heard testimony from, I believe it's called the Southern Shipwatch Alliance, which is an alliance of concerned citizens. They would like something even stronger. They don't want ships parking there at all. I think that's clear. What's been presented, I believe, is a reasonable compromise that prevents the really long stays that are, I think it's fair to say unreasonable that a ship would be anchored for more than 2 weeks immediately adjacent to a rural community in an area that's ecologically sensitive. So looking for some middle ground here. I think they're willing to accept what's contained in the bill, and hopefully this will improve the situation. And as I said before, the assurance we've received from the government is that the other aspects of this bill that are going to improve the supply chain and the flow of goods through our ports are going to reduce the need for extended anchorages in locations like this.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. I'll turn over to Mr. Strahl, followed by Mr. Badaway.
Thank you. I will note that we've now had two different sets of, we had originally when we were talking about anchorages and the emergency powers of the minister, government officials, independent bureaucrats made their views known that this would have major impacts and consequences and unintended consequences on the shipping sector. We've now heard just now from officials that they have concerns with some of the coordinates as proposed. So the idea that we would rubber stamp this with concerns not from partisan players in this game, but from independent officials from the departments who have concerns about this, that we would somehow just say, well, they might have concerns, but we have it all, it's written out here and we want to get this done. I think it would be irresponsible. So I think it's another reason for us to oppose this specific schedule, because specific concerns have been raised now on multiple occasions by departmental officials. So we'll be voting against this.
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. I had Mr. Badaway up first, and then over to you, Mr. Bachrach.
Well, and I thank Mr. Bachrach for his comments, because there's no question that this committee, since going back to 2015, we've established 2 interim reports with respect to transportation logistics strategies. Both interim reports that lead to the same recommendations, just different parts of the country. We do recognize that now we have a St. Lawrence Seaway Management Corporation review, we have a ports modernization review, as well as recommendations attached to both of those, and of course the supply chain task force has come back with their recommendations as well. Mr. Bachrach's correct in stating that we are trying to not only ensure that we recognize those regional hubs, strategic regional hubs within our supply chain, out in the western area of the country being very strategic, but also recognizing how important it is to integrate our supply chains with our neighbors across the border in the United States. And of course, with that comes 2 things. One is the capital, the integrated capital investments that are going to be made to handle the capacities expected within those regional hubs and the supply chains. But secondly is to involve ourselves with full dialogue with the communities that they impact. Whether it be positive or negative, the bottom line is that dialogue has to continue. And I do want to thank and congratulate Mr. Bachrach and his colleagues for doing that, and of course coming back with this sub-amendment that articulates some of the concerns by the residents of that area of the country. Yes, we have to balance that out with respect to ensuring that while this activity, in terms of promoting our economy nationally and binationally, is advantageous within these strategic areas, these strategic trade corridors, we also have to be mindful of some of the impacts it has on the residents in those areas. So I want to thank Mr. Bachrach for that and state, Mr. Chair, that we will be supporting the sub-amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Badaway. Mr. Bachrach.
Mr. Chair, perhaps I could just say that I hear Mr. Strahl's concerns, and I think that what we're tasked with as a committee is striking that balance between the larger national economic needs of the supply chain and the local needs of the people and the environment through which the supply chain passes. And this is an issue no matter whether we're talking about ports, we're talking about anchorages, we're talking about the rail corridor. In the region where I live, there's a great concern about the transport of dangerous goods through communities. Now, it's important that we transport dangerous goods, and transporting them by rail often makes the most sense. But that doesn't mean that the needs of communities and the safety of communities can be overlooked. We need to find a way to achieve both, and I think this amendment tries to strike that balance by limiting the time that ships are able to anchor in sensitive areas. I appreciate that the shipping companies and the port would like maximum flexibility and do not want to have their options limited in any way whatsoever. That's understandable. What we're tasked with is also representing the people who live in the area and managing the impact on what is a unique and sensitive marine environment. So I do think that that this amendment achieves that. And if I can try to reflect back on Ms. Reed's comments, what I heard from her was that she isn't able to confirm that this long list of coordinates in front of us reflects a particular area of concern. And that's a fair comment because it's just a long list of numbers. The idea here was to reflect a geographic area that residents have expressed concern about. The DFO has, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada has indicated is a sensitive marine area, and that Parks Canada has identified as ecologically significant region. So hopefully that's going to be enough for us to push to a vote. I understand that we're not all of one accord on this, and I can respect that. I do think this strikes the right balance, and I hope that it passes.
Thank you, Mr. Backrack. I don't see any other hands up, so we'll go to a vote and ask, shall NDP 17 carry? I'll turn it over to you, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Baraway,
Yes.
Monsieur Iacono,
Oui.
Madame Koutrakis,
Oui.
Miss Yip,
Yes.
Mr. Rogers,
Yes.
Mr. Straw,
No.
Mr. Muse,
No.
Miss Gladue,
No.
Mr. Lewis,
No.
Monsieur Barsalou Duval,
Oui.
Mr. Backrack,
In favor.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. NDP 17 carries. Colleagues, I have 5 more questions for you, and then we can present this back to the House. The first is, shall the short title carry? On division. No, would you like to read out what the short title is? Do we have a short title?
It's been so much discussion.
It's the shortest title of any piece of legislation. Strengthening the Port System and Railway Safety in Canada Act. Okay, on division. Short title carries. Shall the title carry? On division. Title carries on division. Shall the bill as amended carry? We're going to go to a recorded vote on that one. Turned over to you, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Baraway,
Yes.
Monsieur Iacono,
Oui.
Madame Koutrakis,
Oui.
Miss Yip,
Oui.
Mr. Rogers,
Yes.
Mr. Straw,
No.
Mr. Muse,
No.
Miss Gladue,
No.
Mr. Lewis,
No.
Monsieur Barsalou Duval,
Oui.
Mr. Backrack,
In favor.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
The bill carries. Shall the chair report the bill as amended to the House? The chair shall report the bill as amended to the House. And before I ask the last question, I just want to take a moment to thank our wonderful witnesses, department officials who have joined us for several months on this and given us their expertise as well as, most importantly, their time. So thank you very much. And of course, our legislative clerks, who also gave us their time on this. And the last question I have is, shall the committee order a reprint of the bill as amended for the use of the House at report stage? Fine work done. Thank you all very much, colleagues. Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Chair, I'll motion to adjourn.
Did you? Okay. Debatable. So we'll go to a vote. I'll turn it over to you, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Baraway,
Yes.
Monsieur Iacono,
Oui.
Madame Koutrakis,
Oui.
Miss Yip,
Yes.
Mr. Rogers,
Yes.
Mr. Strahl,
No.
Mr. Muse,
No.
Miss Gladieux,
No?
Mr. Lewis,
No.
Monsieur Barcelou Duval,
No.
Mr. Backrack,
No.
5 yeas, 6 nays. Not carried.
Not carried. Okay. Yeah, we can go in camera and talk about what we want to do next. Perhaps we do that.
Motion to go in camera and discuss committee business, I think, would be in order, and I'll make that motion.
Okay, motion to go in camera by Mr. Backrack.
Agreed.
All those in favor? I see no opposition, so we will suspend for 2 minutes as we go in camera. The meeting is now suspended.